She thought throwing me out would end me. What she didn't know was that she had just planted the seed of her own downfall. My name is Tyson. I'm 38 and I work as a real estate developer in Chicago. I've always been quiet, reserved, someone who avoids conflict. I value hard work, loyalty, and family above everything. But when people betray me, I don't argue. I stay silent. I stay still. I remember everything. And I plan. The house always smelled of my mother's cooking. Fresh bread in the mornings, cinnamon tea in the evenings, and the faint trace of lavender she used to sprinkle on the curtains. Every wall carried her touch. Family pictures lined the staircase, her handwriting marked recipe cards tucked in drawers, and the garden bloomed under her care. For me, it wasn't just a house. It was the last living piece of her soul, a place where every memory of my childhood was still alive. After her funeral, I clung to the house as if it were the only raft keeping me from drowning. Relatives came and went, leaving behind flowers, casseroles, and rehearsed condolences. My stepmother, Claire, played the grieving widow well. Black dresses, tears at the right moments, a trembling voice when she spoke to guests. People praised her strength, admired her composure. But I noticed things others didn't. When guests left, her face hardened. The warmth she displayed in public vanished, replaced by a cold efficiency. She packed my mother's belongings into boxes with hands that moved too quickly, as though she couldn't wait to erase her presence. My mother's laughter still echoed in those rooms, but Claire walked through them like they were hers alone. At first, I tried to excuse it. Grief makes people strange. Maybe it was too painful for her to see my mother's dresses still hanging in the closet, her books still stacked neatly by the bed. I told myself she was protecting herself from reminders too sharp to bear. But late at night, I would hear her footsteps, quick and impatient, moving through the house like a conqueror surveying her territory. The first time I confronted her, it was subtle. I asked why my mother's photographs had been taken down from the living room. Claire smiled faintly, tilting her head as if speaking to a child. "It's time to move on, Tyson. Dwelling on the past won't bring her back." Her words cut deeper than she knew. To me, the past wasn't a weight. It was the only thing left of my mother. Every picture, every object was a thread holding me together. But to her, they were clutter. Obstacles standing in the way of the life she wanted to build without my mother. Still, I stayed silent. I had always been the quiet one. When people wronged me, I didn't fight back immediately. I observed. I remembered. There were days when I would walk into the kitchen and find her at the table sipping coffee, already flipping through real estate magazines. She would look up with that same faint smile, one that never reached her eyes, and say, "We'll make this place new again." I knew what she meant. She wanted to strip the house of its history, of its soul, until not a trace of my mother remained. Yet despite all of that, I convinced myself we could coexist, that maybe in time she would soften and the house would continue to be what it had always been, a home filled with love. I worked during the day, kept my distance in the evenings, and walked through the hallways at night, tracing my fingers over the familiar wallpaper, telling myself nothing had changed. But I was lying to myself. The house was changing, and so was she. Slowly, quietly, room by room, my mother was being erased, and deep down I knew this was only the beginning. Claire's reign over the house grew stronger with each passing week. What began with subtle changes like moving a chair or replacing curtains soon spread like ivy across every room. She painted over the soft pastel walls my mother had chosen and replaced them with sharp whites and grays. The warmth that once made the house glow seemed to vanish, leaving behind something colder, harder, almost clinical. At first, I tried to resist. When she carried a box of my mother's books out to the garage, I quietly brought them back in and returned them to the shelves. When she replaced the framed photographs on the mantel with her decorative vases, I moved the vases aside and put the pictures back. These were my little rebellions, my way of keeping my mother alive within the walls. But every time Claire found out, she would smile thinly and say, "Tyson, you need to stop clinging. This house can't remain a shrine forever." Her words sounded calm, but beneath them was steel. I realized she wasn't just trying to redecorate. She was declaring war on every trace of the woman who had come before her. And in that war, I was the only defender. One evening, I came home to find the dining room table gone. It wasn't just a piece of furniture to me. It was the place where my family had gathered for every meal, where birthdays were celebrated, where my mother laughed the loudest. Now the space stood empty, replaced by a sleek glass table that looked like it belonged in a showroom. When I asked about it, Claire shrugged. It was old. It didn't fit the house anymore. Didn't fit the house or didn't fit her vision of it. I started to notice other things too. My mother's garden, once overflowing with roses and marigolds, was reduced to trimmed hedges and gravel paths. The shelves that once carried her recipe books now held expensive wine bottles. Even the air seemed different, sterile, perfumed with artificial scents instead of the natural aromas of home. Still, I fought in silence. Every night I would walk into the attic, a place Claire rarely visited. There I kept the boxes she hadn't touched yet, my mother's clothes, her journals, her old letters. I would sit on the wooden floor holding those relics close, reminding myself that Claire could paint over walls and replace furniture. But she could never strip away what my mother meant to me, yet I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. Claire was patient, methodical. She wasn't rushing. She was dismantling my mother's legacy piece by piece, confident that one day she would erase it entirely. The quiet battles were wearing me down. Each loss felt heavier than the last, and though I didn't show it, I carried the weight like stones in my chest. But I also carried something else, an ember of determination. I didn't know it yet, but every act of hers was shaping something inside me, something stronger than grief. A seed of defiance was growing. For weeks, I convinced myself that Claire's cruelty was limited to furniture, photographs, and memories. She was cold, yes, controlling without question, but I believed that as long as I kept my head down, she would leave me alone. After all, I wasn't a child anymore. I worked, paid my share of bills, stayed out of her way. What reason would she have to turn her sharpness toward me? It didn't take long to find out. The first incident was small. One morning, I left my coffee mug in the sink before heading to work. When I returned home that evening, the mug sat on the counter, shattered into 2 neat pieces. Claire stood nearby, drying her hands. Careless, she said, her voice smooth, almost amused. Things break when they aren't cared for. She held my gaze a moment too long, and I understood. This wasn't about the mug. It was about her reminding me who was in control. After that, the cracks in her mask became more visible. She no longer bothered with her performance when it was just the two of us. If I walked into a room, her eyes narrowed as if my very presence disturbed the air. If I touched something, one of my mother's books, a photo frame she had yet to remove, she would appear behind me, silent and watchful, like a shadow waiting to strike. Meals became battlegrounds. She insisted on cooking, but rarely prepared enough for 2. When I helped myself to food, she would sigh dramatically. You've always been ungrateful, Tyson, always taking more than your share. Her words dripped with poison, and though I ate in silence, every bite burned in my throat. But the moment that shattered my illusions happened late one night. I was in the attic, leafing through my mother's journals, when I heard footsteps climbing the stairs. Claire's voice sliced through the darkness. What are you doing up here? I turned, startled, clutching the journal like a guilty thief. She stepped closer, her eyes glinting with something far colder than anger. This obsession of yours is pathetic. She's gone. Dead. And yet you sit here clinging to her scraps like a child with broken toys. Her words cut deep, but I stayed silent. Silence had always been my shield. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. This house is mine now. Everything in it mine. You live here because I allow it. Remember that. That night I didn't sleep. Her words replayed in my head over and over until they carved themselves into me. It wasn't just about erasing my mother anymore. Claire wanted to erase me too. I was a reminder she couldn't get rid of, a loose thread in her perfect tapestry. From then on, I saw her differently. Every smile she gave neighbors, every sweet word to her friends, every polite gesture in public, it was all a mask. Beneath it was someone ruthless, someone who didn't see me as family, but as an obstacle to her power. And I realized something even darker. If she could erase my mother from the house, what was to stop her from trying to erase me next? The quiet battles were no longer enough. I would need to prepare for war. I used to think silence was my safe place. Growing up, I'd retreat into it whenever arguments erupted, whenever the world pressed too hard against my chest. But after my mother's funeral, silence became something different. It wasn't shelter anymore, it was survival. Claire's words from the attic echoed in my mind, sharp as broken glass. This house is mine now. You live here because I allow it. Each syllable carried a weight I couldn't shake. I stopped moving through the house as though I belonged. Instead, I became a shadow within my own home. My footsteps grew softer. My voice, already quiet, vanished altogether. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I watched. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Neighbors still waved at Claire as she pruned the garden. Friends still came over for wine and whispered conversations, where she played the role of the strong, grieving widow. They praised her courage, her resilience. Not once did they notice me slipping silently through the halls like a ghost, unseen, unheard. But I noticed everything. Every time she took another photograph off the wall, I memorized the expression on her face, not sorrow, not loss, but satisfaction. Every time she shifted furniture or replaced my mother's curtains with her own choices, I saw the spark in her eyes grow brighter. She wasn't grieving. She was conquering. Inside, I was breaking. My mother's presence was fading faster than I could hold on. The house no longer smelled of lavender or fresh bread. It smelled of Claire's perfume, sharp and invasive, like a warning. I would sit at the edge of my bed, gripping my mother's journals in my hands, whispering her name just to hear it in the air. Some nights I thought I could still feel her in the walls. Other nights I knew Claire was right. My mother was gone, and all I had left were fragments. Still, I kept my silence. I didn't fight when Claire locked certain rooms, declaring them off limits. I didn't speak when she invited real estate agents over under the guise of friendly chats. I didn't flinch when she started withholding small things, mail that never reached me, bills I never saw, food that seemed to vanish quicker than I remembered. I stayed still. I let her think she was winning, but inside a shift was happening. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was calculation. Every cruel word, every controlling gesture, every quiet theft of what was once mine. I recorded it all, storing it like kindling, waiting for a match. The night I truly understood this change, I was sitting alone in the kitchen. Claire had gone to bed, leaving her wine glass half finished on the counter. I stared at it, at the lipstick stain on the rim, at the small pool of red that clung to the bottom. I imagined knocking it over, watching it spill across the counter, spreading like blood. My hand twitched, but I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I cleaned the glass, dried it carefully, and placed it back where it belonged. I told myself the same words I had whispered since childhood. Patience, Tyson. Patience. She thought I was broken. She thought her silence had crushed mine. But she didn't know the truth. I wasn't defeated. I was waiting. Revenge doesn't arrive in sudden outbursts. It's not fire, it's ice. Cold, deliberate, precise. By the time anyone notices, it's already too late. For months, I let Claire believe I was fading into the background. I played the obedient stepson, quiet and unthreatening. When she snapped at me, I lowered my head. When she pushed boundaries, I yielded. I let her think she was winning because arrogance is its own trap. She never noticed how closely I watched her. Her routines, her weaknesses, her blind spots. I started small. Notes in a worn journal scribbled late at night. What time she left for errands. Which wine she preferred. The passwords she tapped into her laptop when she thought no one was looking. At first it felt mechanical, like I was simply documenting her existence. But slowly the pages began to form a map, a design, a plan. Claire believed control meant ownership. But control has cracks. She liked to drink at night, one glass after another, until her movements grew sloppy. She liked to flaunt her spending, buying furniture and clothes she didn't need. Her vanity bleeding into recklessness. She liked attention, desperate to keep up her facade of elegance. Every indulgence was a weakness, and I intended to use them all. The first stage was information. I scoured my mother's old files, her bank records, her will. Claire had moved quickly after the funeral, transferring titles, hiding documents. But she wasn't careful enough. In the back of a drawer, I found a copy of the deed. My mother had ensured her share of the house passed to me. Claire had hidden it, hoping I'd never realize. That discovery lit something inside me, not just hope, but fuel. The second stage was patience. I worked longer hours, saved every penny, built a quiet reserve of independence. On weekends, I visited libraries under the pretense of escaping the house, but in truth, I was researching property law, inheritance loopholes, and eviction rights. Every fact I gathered became another brick in the structure I was building. And the third stage, preparation. I kept my distance, rarely speaking, rarely reacting, but always watching. When she hosted her friends, I listened from the hall, catching pieces of her stories. She lied about me often, painting me as ungrateful as a burden. They pitied her. I let them. Because soon, pity would turn to shock. One night, sitting in my room, I spread the papers across my desk, bank statements, photocopies of deeds, notes on her behavior. It didn't look like revenge yet. It looked like chaos, but in my mind it was becoming clear. I could already see the moment her mask would shatter, the exact way her carefully built image would collapse in front of the same friends who once admired her. I whispered to myself as I stared at the evidence. This isn't anger. This is correction. She took what was never hers. I'm simply taking it back. For the first time since my mother's funeral, I felt calm. Truly calm, because revenge wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a blueprint. Revenge is never loud at the start. It begins as whispers, shifts in the wind too subtle to notice. By the time the storm arrives, the sky has already darkened. I didn't confront Claire directly. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, I began dismantling her carefully built world piece by piece, so slowly she didn't realize until it was already falling apart. The first strike was financial. Claire prided herself on luxury. Wine shipments, boutique dresses, catered dinners for her circle of friends. She lived as though the money would never end. But she was careless. With quiet precision, I found her hidden accounts. Passwords she thought I hadn't seen. Email confirmations she deleted, but not thoroughly enough. I forwarded the right details to the right places. Her creditors, her bank, even her business contacts. Slowly, the overdraft notices began to arrive. Letters she tore open with shaking hands, her perfect smile faltering. The second strike was social. Claire's image depended on admiration. She needed her friends to envy her home, her gatherings, her poise. I began releasing truths not in anger, but in whispers that carried like smoke. A comment slipped into conversation with a neighbor about how quickly she cleared out my mother's belongings. A casual remark at a dinner about her late-night drinking habits. I never accused. I only planted seeds. And seeds once sown grow on their own. Soon I noticed her friends' glances lingered longer, their smiles more strained. The third strike was legal. I had the deed, my mother's final safeguard. It was ironclad, proof that Claire's control over the house was never absolute. I spoke with a lawyer, presenting the documents with calm certainty. She's been living as though it's hers, I explained, but it isn't. Not entirely. The lawyer nodded, promising discretion. Papers began moving quietly behind the scenes, forming the trap that would one day snap shut. Claire, of course, sensed something. She grew sharper, her words colder. One evening, she snapped, "Why are you always watching me, Tyson? Don't you have a life?" I only smiled faintly, replying, "Some of us don't need to perform for an audience." She didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on me longer than usual, suspicion creeping in. That was fine. Suspicion meant fear, and fear made people sloppy. The most satisfying strike, though, was the one she never saw at all. Late one night, when the house was silent, I walked into the living room. She had begun redecorating, replacing my mother's curtains, painting over her colors, filling the shelves with glossy, soulless ornaments. I stood there for a long time, then quietly rehung one of my mother's old photographs on the wall. Just one. A simple portrait of her smiling in the garden. When Claire saw it the next morning, she froze. Her coffee cup trembled. She said nothing, but I saw the fury in her eyes, the way her jaw tightened. That was the point. My strikes weren't meant to destroy her all at once. They were meant to remind her every day, every moment, that she wasn't untouchable, that the ghost of the woman she tried to erase was still here, and that I was watching. By then, the blueprint was no longer just paper and ink. It was in motion. Real. Alive. And Claire was beginning to realize. Her empire was built on sand. It was 5 years before I set foot in that house again. 5 years of silence, of patience, of building what Claire thought I never could. I worked 2 jobs, lived quietly, and invested every spare dollar. Slowly, steadily, I built my own foundation. One she couldn't touch, one she couldn't sabotage. The deed to the house was my anchor all those years. I kept it locked away. Proof that no matter how loudly Claire tried to claim ownership, the truth was written in ink stronger than her lies. She thought time would erase me, that distance would weaken my hold, but time only sharpened me. When I finally returned, it wasn't as the quiet stepson she had tried to erase. It was as the rightful owner. The reunion fell on a warm evening. Claire had invited her circle of friends, neighbors, business associates, people who once whispered admiration but now regarded her with suspicion. She greeted them at the door in a dress too bright, a smile too wide, as if daring the world to see her as anything less than perfect. But perfection cracks under pressure, and I was there to supply it. I arrived unannounced, wearing a simple suit. No grand entrance, no raised voice, just the sound of my footsteps crossing the polished floor. The room fell into silence, every eye shifting to me. Claire's smile froze when she saw me. Her wineglass trembled slightly in her hand. "Tyson," she managed, her voice thin. "What are you doing here?" I met her gaze calmly. "I'm home." The words were simple, but the effect was seismic. Conversations halted, forks hovered in midair. Her friends glanced at one another, curiosity flickering like sparks. Claire laughed nervously, waving her hand as though brushing off a child's fantasy. "This isn't your home anymore. You left." I slipped a folded document from my jacket pocket and laid it on the dining table. The deed, my mother's final safeguard. Gasps rippled around the room as guests leaned closer, recognizing the official seals. "I didn't leave," I said softly. I waited. "There's a difference." Her face drained of color. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her hand gripped the back of a chair as though she might collapse without it. One of her friends whispered, "Is it true? You never owned this place?" Another voice followed, sharper. "All this time?" The mask Claire wore cracked right there under the weight of her audience. She stammered, reaching for excuses, but her words tangled, meaningless. For years she had built her identity on lies, on pretending the house was hers, on erasing my mother from its walls, on silencing me. But lies collapse quickly when light floods in. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I only looked at her and said, "You tried to take everything from me. But this house, it remembers who it belongs to." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Claire lowered her gaze. For the first time, she looked small, defeated. I turned to the guests, my tone calm, measured. "You've all known her version of this story. Tonight you know mine. This house was never hers, and it never will be. When I left that night, I didn't need to see the rest. Her circle was crumbling, her reputation unraveling. And the house, the home my mother built, was mine again, not through rage or force, but through patience and truth. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and that whisper can level empires. The house was quiet when I returned the next morning. No guests, no voices, no laughter, only the sound of my footsteps echoing against the walls my mother once touched. For the first time in years, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like it was breathing again, as though her presence had returned to reclaim what was hers. Claire was gone. She left in the night, I was told, taking only a suitcase. The rest, her dresses, her ornaments, her expensive furniture, remained behind like abandoned trophies from a game she had lost. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Her departure was the final act of defeat, the silence after the storm. I walked through each room slowly. My mother's photograph still hung in the living room, the one I had placed years earlier to haunt Claire. This time, though, it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a welcome. I touched the frame gently, whispering words I hadn't spoken aloud since she passed. "We're home, Mom. We're home again." The neighborhood shifted too. People looked at me differently now, not as the quiet stepson lingering in shadows, but as the man who had endured and returned with dignity. Some tried to apologize for not seeing sooner, for believing Claire's performance. I accepted their words without anger. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. That chapter had closed. At night, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind move through the garden my mother planted. The air smelled faintly of lavender again, as though time itself had bent to restore what she left behind. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, whole. Revenge had carried me through the darkest years of my life, but it wasn't the victory that satisfied me. It was the restoration, the quiet proof that patience and truth cut deeper than rage ever could. Claire had wanted to erase my mother's memory. Instead, her absence made that memory stronger, etched forever into the walls, the garden, and into me. I thought back to the boy I had been at the funeral, silent, broken, unsure if I could survive without the woman who raised me. I didn't recognize that boy anymore. I had become something else, someone forged by betrayal but defined by endurance. Justice had been delivered, not with fire, not with fury, but with silence, patience, and the unshakable truth. And as I stood in the doorway of the house that raised me, the house I now fully owned, I realized something. Revenge was never about destroying her. It was about preserving us, about protecting the legacy of the woman who gave me life, love, and the strength to wait. The storm had passed. The house was mine again, and so was the peace.